Hello, this is the fourth and final lesson on Vogue magazine from 1965 for component 2 of the Media Studies exam. This is a session on audience, having already covered representations and media language and also media industries. So the kind of learning objectives for this session are really fourfold. The aims are to analyse the target audience of Vogue by applying various models of audience classification. We're also going to look at the ways in which a magazine's success can be measured. The session will consider the impact that a magazine may have had on different audiences, and then finally evaluate the various ways in which a magazine can be used and read by the audience as well. So starting with audience classification, something we have done for most of the text that we've looked at throughout this entire course, whether that's component 1 or component 2. So as we've discussed in relation to the economic contexts in the industry session, most magazines actually generate a significant amount of their revenue through advertising. The amount that publishers are able to charge for advertising space, whether that's a full page or a double page spread, largely depends on the size and of course the nature of the audience as well. That's why grouping and categorising audiences is vitally important in the magazine industry, as publishers have to be able to demonstrate their ability to reach particular demographics and psychographic groups in order to persuade advertisers to buy space in their publications. And of course, as we know, as we've been studying, there are several ways of classifying the target audience of any media product. And the first way we looked at was to create a profile of the audience or the potential audience. And most magazine publishers will actually do this on a daily basis. They'll imagine a specific audience member when they're planning an edition, writing, editing. Whenever they're putting together the next copy of the magazine, they will think of an imaginary person who is their specific target audience. And this enables them to make something that appeals to that specific interests of that whole group of people. So they have to know that person inside and out. So they'll know their gender, they'll know their age, their family situation, i.e. whether they're married, they have dependents such as children, whether they live at home or away. They'll know their level of education. They'll know what political beliefs they have, if they have any. They'll be aware of their ethnicity, their religion, as well as their self-image, which is to do with the way that that person perceives themselves, maybe within a group of friends or within their own life. And also maybe more practical things such as their hobbies and their interests, and of course vitally what other media they're likely to consume. So this is a very useful way of knowing and getting inside the mind of your specific target audience. For some media texts, a lot of these elements are really important, but for other media texts and products, some of these subjectivities really aren't relevant at all. The second model we've looked at is the income and status model, sometimes known as the ABC model. And this is still popular amongst producers of magazines and newspapers, it has to be said, for determining the target audience based on their income and the work that they do. Perhaps it's still popular because it's able to tell potential advertisers everything they need to know about who's going to see their adverts. In other words, how much money they have. So this goes from A, who are the upper middle classes, to B, the middle class, C1s, lower middle classes, and C2s, the skilled working classes, down to D, who are working class, and E's, which are the people in society at the bottom level or lowest level of income. And we've discussed the relative merits but also the limitations of this model in the past, so do have a look at your notes for those. I would suggest that actually this model is most useful when it's used in conjunction with an audience profile. But perhaps the most useful of the different classification methods we've studied this year is Young and Rubicam's 4Cs model. This came about when advertising agency Young and Rubicam developed their own method of classification by using psychologist Albert Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They understood that all human motivation is governed by the needs that we have. Young and Rubicam then decided that the entire mass audience of consumers could fit into 7 groups. and everybody will fit into at least one of the 7 categories, and most media products will appeal to one of the following 4 groups, because that media text will either fulfill or sometimes challenge the particular needs of that person. So let's just quickly remind ourselves of the 4 groups that are usually targeted within the media. First of all, the mainstream. These are the people who live in the world of the domestic and the everyday. Their routine is fundamental to the way that they live their lives. Their life choices are we rather than me. As their name suggests, they are the mainstream of society, and they're the largest group within the 4 Cs across the world. Inevitably, they respond to established brands and to family brands, things that offer value for money. And whilst their core need in life, according to Jung and Rubicam, is for security, obviously this can mean different things. It doesn't necessarily mean locking doors. The security in consuming something familiar and predictable and reliable. So I think the word familiarity is perhaps a better way of describing their core need in life. A second group is the aspirer, who are materialistic and acquisitive people who are driven by other people's perceptions of them rather than their own values, and as a result they respond to what others perceive as being superficial, things like image and appearance, persona and charisma, and of course fashion. To them, an attractive package is as important as its contents, and their core need in life is for status. The succeeder is an interesting group to study and often harder to define or to work out how products appeal to them. But succeeders possess very strong self-confidence and have a strong goal orientation. They tend to be very organised people, and as a result they tend to occupy positions of responsibility in society or high-powered jobs. Their investment in the status quo means that they tend to support it. Even when it comes to brands, they seek prestige and reward, and will often seek out the best because they believe it's what they deserve. On the other hand, they also seek out caring and protective brands. Their aggressive attitude to life means that every now and then they will need to relax, and their core need in life is for control. So that's why you'll often find them seeking out media products, for example, that will give them added information, will enable them to become at the cutting edge or the leading edge of society. And then finally, our last category is the explorer, and these people are driven for a need for discovery, challenge and new frontiers. Young in nature, if not in reality, explorers are often the first to try out new ideas and new experiences, and they respond to brands that offer new sensations, indulgence and instant effects. In short, difference is what they seek, and their core need in life is for discovery. So the shorthand for this is that they will look maybe for media products that are more alternative or unusual, or offer them something away from the mainstream. So if we think back to our 1965 edition of Vogue, we need to ask a few questions and work out exactly who the target audience was. You'll need to decide who this is, and of course you'll need to prove the points that you're making. And as always, you need to use as much of the magazine as possible for this, not just the cover or the contents page, but the inside pages and even the advertisements that we've studied from inside this 1965 edition of Vogue. This means you'll be able to analyse images, layout and copy to determine how the mode of address communicates with the audience you've decided is being targeted. So, number 1, write a profile for who you think the audience is. Give as much relevant information as possible, including which of the income and status categories you think the audience fits into. And as a little hint here, you may need to do some additional contextual research to discover other types of media that the target audience would have been consuming in 1965. And secondly, give a selection of different codes from the magazine that prove that the target audience may be from either the aspirer or the succeeder audience categories. So try and find evidence for both and match that up with the various needs that the aspirer and the succeeder has. So let's move on to magazine success and see how we can measure that. Because the target audience is just as important to the advertisers as it is to the producers of the magazine, the publishers will provide potential advertisers not only with information about the demographic details and a psychographic profile to the reader, but also with readership and circulation figures, which are two terms that we haven't really discussed before. So, just to differentiate the two, readership is an estimate of how many readers a magazine has. As most publications have more than one reader per copy, in other words, a magazine will be taken home and passed around a family, or be in a waiting room of a dentist or a doctor's, or even perhaps left on a bus or something like that. So there's often more than one reader per copy of a magazine. The National Readership Survey, or the NRS, their readership estimate is very different from the second figure, which is the circulation. Circulation is a count of how many copies of that particular publication are distributed or sold, including subscriptions. Circulation audits are provided by the ABC, the Audit Bureau of Circulations. And this image here is from the magazine's media pack, which I referenced in the industry lesson. The media pack provides data and information for advertisers about who buys the magazine that they're going to pay for advertising space in. Now, if you have a look how much importance they place on the audience using the income and status model, you can see that that's still relevant to them. And of course it helps the advertisers determine the brands that are advertised in the magazine, whether they're pitched at the right level. So the next section is on audience responses, and as students of media, we're not only interested in who the audience is, but also what they do with the product and how they respond to it. And added to this, of course, it's widely discussed the extent to which magazines influence the behaviour, attitudes and even the beliefs of an audience. And all of these things can broadly be discussed as the audience's response to the media. Now, we've covered this for pretty much all of the other media products that we've studied so far this year. And there are two main models relating to the theoretical framework of media studies that can be applied in our understanding of magazines. And the first one is one that should be familiar with you, Gerbner's cultivation model. And this really came about as an alternative to outdated media effects models, like the infamous hypodermic syringe model. And this is Gerbner's cultivation model, which suggests that exposure to repeated patterns of representation over long periods of time can shape and influence the way that people perceive the world around them, essentially cultivating particular social and cultural attitudes or ideologies. So as women's magazines tend to be read on a regular basis, they would be seen to lend themselves particularly well to Gerbner's theory. As discussed when studying representations, women's magazines can influence perhaps gender norms, particularly regarding the specific roles of men and women in society, as well as promoting specific templates of femininity and body image. Now, I did reference the hypodermic syringe model just then. If you can't remember what this is, because we haven't spent much time studying it, it is, as I said, an outdated media effects model. It is one that used to be taught and studied, and some people still feel that it has validity. The model suggests that the media can have a direct and immediate effect on the audience. For example, a violent text, perhaps a film or a video game, could make someone behave in a violent way. However, the theory is considered outdated, and you can probably see this as straight away. It does treat the mass audience as entirely passive and all entirely the same. So how is Gerbner different from this? Well, the cultivation model differs from the hypodermic syringe model in two main ways. Firstly, it focuses on the effects of long-term exposure rather than a sort of immediate injection, an immediate effect. So Gerbner is suggesting that media can have an impact, but over a long term. And the second one is that it suggests that ideologies are shaped by patterns of media representations rather than by a single media product. So in short, really, what Gerbner was saying was that the media can have an influence, but really only on existing ideologies or in tandem with other influences in society. It's rare that the media would be one person's only influence on their ideological beliefs. Your parents, your upbringing, your peers, all of these things will have an impact on your belief system, and the media, according to Gerbner, is one of those things that contributes over a long period of time. So you can probably tell that to understand anything to do with media, audience responses to media, we have to fully understand the ideologies of the particular text. And so probably make a good time now to remind ourselves of the key ideologies of the 1965 edition of Vogue that we've been studying. So this is very brief and very succinct, but first of all, of course, this magazine, as all Vogue magazines do, is champion appearance. The suggestion is that appearance is important, particularly in the fashion world, and that fashion is seen as an important pastime or hobby, or even something that people should pursue. The second ideology that we discussed, and this is based a lot on the context of the time, is one of female empowerment, even if this is maybe potentially contradicted, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later. But female empowerment does seem to be one of the key messages of Vogue, even at this early 1965 time. And thirdly, one thing we cannot ignore is that this does have consumerist ideologies. All of the clothes in the magazine have a price tag. Fashion is an industry which is part of a capitalist society, so it does hold consumerist ideologies. So now that we can understand the ideologies of the text we're studying, we can start to apply an old friend Hall's reception theory. This provides a really useful framework for exploring the different ways in which the messages in the magazines might be decoded or read. Hall's theory recognises that readers do not all interpret the media products in the same way. However, despite recognising that the audience will decode it based on their own ideologies, Hall doesn't believe that there are an infinite amount of readings. Instead, he suggests that an audience member will take one of these readings based on how the text has positioned them. The first one, the preferred, dominant or hegemonic reading. The second one is known as the negotiated reading. And the third is the oppositional reading. Now, we've covered these in some detail in the past, but just to reiterate and just as a refresher, the preferred or hegemonic reading is the position that the encoders or the producers of the media encourage the audience to adopt when they're interpreting a text. If we adopt the dominant hegemonic position, we read or interpret the message in the way the encoder intended. We are essentially making a preferred reading. A negotiated reading is where the position, an audience is positioned in a way that means that they acknowledge broadly the legitimacy of the messages that a media product might contain, but adopt those messages to better understand their own experiences. So in some ways we're kind of making the media product make sense to ourselves. We might not fully agree with every single message, but we understand the point of the text and broadly agree with it. And then finally the oppositional reading. Now I think the common mistake with the oppositional reading is that people would say, well, if you just don't like a media text then you are taking an oppositional reading, but it's a little bit more complex than that. This is really the interpretation an audience member takes with a media product if they disagree with the messages or the values that it conveys. But of course, to do that, they have to be able to understand what those messages are. So let's put some of these ideas into question form. And as always, remember to consider all of the magazine when thinking about some answers to this. The first question is, how might Gerbner's theory be applied to the 1965 edition of Vogue magazine? In what ways, for example, might the representations and the ideologies that it offers be seen to cultivate particular values, attitudes and beliefs to its readers? As a hint, consider representations of gender. Secondly, how important is it to consider the context of the time when you're applying Gerbner's cultivation theory? Number 3, give examples from the text that suggest that the target audience would make the preferred reading of the magazine. Now for this question number 3, you'll obviously have to consider what you said in the previous questions about who the target audience was. Number 4. How might the gender, ethnicity, sexuality or social class affect the way in which the audience would read the magazine? Number 5. How might the attitudes, the values and the beliefs affect the way in which the audience might interpret the ideologies and representations in the magazine? And then finally, number 6. How important is the context of the time in understanding the magazine? Would a modern Vogue audience take a different reading of the 1965 edition of the magazine? So we move on to our final section in this audience session and look at the uses and gratifications model as well as other appeals really. And of course this theory is particularly useful when considering the relationship between magazines and audiences, developed by Bloomer and Katz in the 1970s. And again, rather than seeing the audience as easily manipulated passive mass, as many effects theories from around that time did, the uses and gratifications model suggests that an audience actively seek out media products in order to fulfill a variety of needs that they have. And they Bloomer and Katz outlined 4 different needs. The first one was information, sometimes known as surveillance. The second one was entertainment and escapism. Remember that entertainment isn't always being made to laugh, it can be being made to feel as well. Some ways entertainment is a sense of drama as well as a sense of humour. Personal identification and how texts encourage us to identify with various people and ideas. And the final one, social interaction, how we can use the media to become more sociable, and we can use them to sort of oil the wheels of communication, if you like. Magazines can be seen to meet these particular needs, and obviously in a number of different ways, as researchers such as Hermes have shown. Hermes conducted extensive interviews with readers on women's magazines in order to find out how they use the products. One of her main findings was that women's magazines are primarily used as a means of relaxation. The fact that they are easy to put down was said to be a particular source of appeals. They could be made to fit within the routines of everyday life. However, it is important that we consider about the uses and gratifications. It might potentially be a limited model. And we have to remember, of course, it's over 40 years old. Think about what appeals a modern audience would expect from their media that may have been irrelevant when this theory was first cited. And once you've thought about that, you can answer some questions about the 1965 edition of Vogue. Obviously, there is a number of appeals for its target audience, and this makes the uses and gratifications model an important one to consider. Remember to find the evidence from across the whole magazine, and therefore I'd like you to consider the following questions. What particular information or advice does the magazine offer to its readers? Number 2. In what ways could the magazine be seen to distract or divert its readers from the routines of everyday life? What particular pleasures does the magazine offer? Number 3. How might the magazine be used to construct or to consolidate a sense of identity? And then fourthly, in what ways might the magazine be seen to facilitate a sense of belonging? What opportunities does it provide for interaction with others?